Okay, basically, the last chapter of the Duchess War. Over there. Yeah, like right there. Like, Minnie was like, oh no, I'm falling in love with Robert. Oh no. And she's like, oh no, because Robert is the Duke of whatever. And Minnie rides in the second class compartment. And more than that, Robert is revealed to have had a traumatic childhood because his mom is like, I hate you, and his dad is like, I'm a rapist, and it's not good. And then he looks at Sebastian's family, and he's like, oh, I want them to be my family. He makes up this whole thing about how they're all happy, and the dad teaches him how to fish, and everything's good. But then they meet him, and they're like, you were just like your dad, and it's devastating. He's devastated, and that's why he's so sad all the time. Ugh. Freaking book. On with chapter 14 of The Duchess War.
The Duchess War by Courtney Milan. Chapter 14. Minnie didn't see the Duke at all in the days that followed, but it was impossible not to think of him. She examined his paper under a borrowed jeweler's lens, poked at the ink used in his handbills, catalogued the vagaries of the type used to create it. There was a lowercase e that had a hairline crack in the lower stem. She'd seen it on 4 separate handbills now, and a b that was a bit misshapen. All the proof that she'd found added up. Details, all of that. Now that she had his letter, it was all rendered superfluous. More importantly, when she imagined herself in the streets of Leicester, she no longer saw herself industriously collecting paper samples, but striding arm in arm with the Duke of Claremont. Stupid. She was so stupid. She told herself that all too often, and yet found that she could not make herself stop thinking of him. She remembered the feel of his lips, the look in his eyes. She remembered his hands warm on her body. She remembered everything he'd told her, and she didn't feel stupid. She looked at her reflection in the mirror one afternoon. You, she told herself, are an idiot. Her gray eyes looked back at her solemnly. He'd sent over a message. His cousin was delivering a penny reading that evening for the Leicester Mechanical Society, and he'd asked her to come. Minnie suspected that she shouldn't go. The stupidity of what she wanted was evident just from her own mirror. She wore a plain blue gown, blue, once he'd seen twice already. It was severe and high-necked, the sleeves long but unadorned. There was scarcely a hint of a bustle, and her skirt sported no flounces, no cunning knots. Fabric was dear, ribbons dearer. It was simple logic to dress like this when there was so little extra money. Garb like this, nobody would look at her. She didn't want people to look at her. But she wanted to make him smile. Oh, Minnie! Oh, Minnie, she said in despair. Really, him? Could you be any more hopeless? He was a duke. She was... Look, damn you, she said. And she forced herself to look in the mirror. Not to focus on the pleasant parts, the curve of her bosom or her waist, but to really look at who she was. To look at that scar on her cheek. No, Minnie. That wasn't just skin deep. It was etched on her soul. Wilhelmina Pursling was dried up, severe, quiet, mousy. Miss Pursling, Minnie enunciated very slowly, is a nobody, by design. But those were still her eyes looking out at her. And no matter what she told herself, no matter how many times she named herself a fool, that wild, untamed want welled up in her. You, she repeated, stabbing her finger at the mirror, are an idiot. Still, if she was going to be an idiot, she might as well be one in style. And so she went downstairs and out into the fallow fields. She tromped up one hill and down another, searching for the sheltered south sides until she found what she was looking for. A patch of late yellow pansies hidden in the cornstalks, and she harvested them all. Page break! If any stars shone behind the thick blanket of fog and smoke, Robert couldn't see them. He descended from the carriage and then turned to help Violet out. The street lamps let out a dull and heavy illumination, enough to show a gathered mass of people waiting on the front steps of New Hall. In the night, all the clothing looked black, and the effect was almost funeral. They would have been had they not been chanting. Ah, good, Sebastian said at his side. There's a crowd. A mob, Robert said. Sebastian simply rubbed his hands together in glee. When I speak, it's usually the same thing. Are those things goats? They were. In the market square outside the hall, someone had set up 2 temporary enclosures. There were placards tied to both, but he couldn't read them in the dark. Still, one of those pens was filled with goats, nearly a dozen of the beasts milling about and bleating. The other enclosure, oddly enough, was filled with children. Small children, more of them than there were goats. Robert frowned as he drew closer. The tallest of the children would scarcely have reached his waist. The youngest was barely walking, stumbling after the others in grim determination. None of the shouts came from the children. All that tumultuous yelling came from the surrounding adults. As they came abreast of the enclosures, Robert could finally read the signs. "These are animals," proclaimed one grim placard that graced the goat enclosure. The sign over the pen that held the children read, "These are not." Robert glanced at Sebastian. His cousin was still smiling. He'd always enjoyed stirring matters to boiling, but there was an edge to his smile. Sebastian took a few steps forward until he faced the children. The children were far more confused than the goats. One small boy had his hands on the middle rail of the fence. He wore only a light coat and thin gloves. If he'd had a cap, it had fallen off. His eyes seemed luminous in the cold of night. His breath made puffs of cold air. Sebastian bent down, and the shouts redoubled. "We are not animals," a woman was saying. "We are not animals." They weren't shouting at Sebastian. Nobody chanting recognized him. To their eye, he was just another gentleman taking in the spectacle. Just another reason to hear their own voices. Slowly, Sebastian unwound his scarf from his neck. Without saying a word, he set it around the small boy's neck. Wait, what? What the fuck? The addition of the oversized scarf made the child look even smaller. Sebastian nodded wordlessly and then turned to go, "I thought he was strangling the kid." "What do you think you're doing?" a nearby woman screeched. "That's my son. We don't need your charity." Sebastian kept walking. "If you listen to that madman lecturing tonight," the woman yelled at his retreating back, "you stand to lose your immortal soul. We want none of that devil's teachings here." Sebastian didn't look back. The woman watched him leave, setting her hands on her hips. Her lips pursed, her fingers tapped in impatience. Finally, she turned to her son. "What were you doing, sitting there like a lump then?" She took hold of one end of Sebastian's scarf and gave it a yank. "I told you to chant. I want to hear you chant. Try it now. I'm not—" She stopped mid-sentence, on the verge of pulling off Sebastian's scarf, as Robert came to stand by her. She looked at his boots, then followed them up to his trousers, his waistcoat, until she saw his face. "Madam," Robert said, "do you by any chance know the temperature of this evening?"
And that is the super interesting cliffhanger that we end on for The Duchess War, Chapter 14. Watch the next video to finish Chapter 14.